Hello, welcome to this week's HSJ Health Check Podcast. I'm Dave West, HSJ Deputy Editor. In this week's episode, we're going to focus on First Do No Harm, the name of an independent review report published for the government by Baroness Julia Cumberlege and her team this week on the harm caused to many women by 3 separate medical interventions over recent years. I'm joined to do so by HSJ Correspondent for Safety and Quality, Matt Discombe, and by HSJ Editor Alastair McLellan. And the report has been relatively low profile in its development, although there's been coverage of some of the harm caused to women and over the recent years. But the report itself struck us with the strength and breadth of its recommendations that it made for the health service and for government. So, Matt, could you bring us up to date with the background to this case and the recommendations made in the report?
Yes. So just to reiterate, this is a major government commissioned review, which was commissioned by Jeremy Hunt in 2018 when he was Health Secretary. One of the many stark findings which we picked out of the report is that he says the NHS has either lost sight of the interests of all those it was set up to serve, or does not know how best to do this. So to give you some background to this, it follows an investigation into the use of 3 treatments or medical devices such as pelvic mesh implants, pregnancy tests such as Primodose, which was withdrawn in the 1970s, and sodium valproate, which is an anti-epileptic drug. The review spoke to more than 700 people, mostly women, who have suffered avoidable harm from these treatments, but it did say that thousands of patients have likely been affected. The things it points out are systemic and institutional resistance throughout the health service to legitimate and mounting concerns over patient safety. It talks about a system which doesn't work in a joined-up fashion and lacks leadership, and mistakes are perpetuated through a culture of denial, a resistance to no-blame learning, absence of effective accountability, and women being completely stigmatized. It talks of some of their concerns being brushed off as women's problems and just not taken seriously, which and it's that treatment of women which has been highlighted in other reports. So there's a lot of reaction, I suppose, to that. To that aspect being brought up again. Now, in terms of the recommendations, one of them has been met already, that the government immediately issues a fulsome apology. Nadine Dorries has just done this in the House of Commons. What she's not done is commit to any of the other major recommendations yet. And if I can run through those quickly, it talks around an independent patient safety commissioner to be appointed, to be an advocate for patient safety and to listen to people's concerns, hold the system to account in a kind of non-political way, but in a very public way as well, to hold the government and the NHS to account, for an independent redress agency for those harmed by medicines and medical devices, for compensation schemes to be set up for each of the medical treatments, and for the MHRA to be overhauled, for a register of doctors' financial and non-pecuniary interests. So this is a major report. It's got a lot of eye-catching recommendations, and we will see what happens with it. Nadine Dorries did not commit earlier in the Commons to responding to it in full by the end of September, so we'll see what happens. But yeah, it's a major report.
All right, thanks. And as you say, just to reiterate that, the strength of the central or overriding broad message that the NHS has either lost sight of the interests of all those it was set up to serve, or does not know how best to do this. And so given the strength of that message, critique of the NHS, which often is newsworthy, there's been relatively little coverage of this, relatively little prominent coverage of it across the rest of the media. And one obvious reason for that being the situation with coronavirus ongoing. But Alastair, I wondered your impression of, through your experience of how these reports land. Why do you think this one has not so far got quite the coverage that we would expect from such a strong message?
Yeah, so we're speaking just in the moments after Nadine Dorris's statement in Parliament, and during that debate, Jeremy Hunt, the man who commissioned the review, made a gallant attempt to get them to commit to following its recommendations, and particularly made the point that why isn't the Secretary of State for Health responding to what is such a report which makes such a fundamental challenge to the performance of the NHS. And he got very short shrift from Nadine Dorris. So what we saw in Parliament a few moments ago was the Cumberlege report being buried. And why is that? Well, I'd like to illustrate what has happened with a bit of a story from my past, if people will, and the NHS's past, if listeners will indulge me. Back at the turn of the last decade, the noughties into the tens, I went to a meeting with a Labour government minister in the Houses of Parliament, and we had a conversation about what the government could do for the nursing profession. And I said, well, it's striking that New Labour has not had a major review of the nursing profession during its time, and that it was about time it did. And I suggested that they could look at having a royal commission. They took up that idea, though it didn't. But in the end, it turned into a Prime Minister's commission into the future of nursing. I think they needed to do something quicker than a royal commission would do, and it was duly launched by the Prime Minister, by Gordon Brown, in 2009. Of course, in 2010, the Labour lost power, and the coalition government came to power, and the review's recommendations were ignored. Basically, Lansley, who had an uneasy relationship with the Andrew Lansley, Health Secretary at the time, he had an uneasy relationship with the Health Service, and quite honestly, that coalition government wasn't going to do anything that New Labour had done. So the report died a death. So if we now compare that situation to one that the Cumberlege report was commissioned by Jeremy Hunt, somebody who cares a lot about patient safety, and has been received by a Secretary of State, Matthew Hancock, who has much less interest in it. There's little love lost between Jeremy Hunt and Matthew Hancock as a result of the Conservative Party leadership contest. Of course, Hunt, now as Health Select Committee Chair, is in a position, and because of he was the longest serving Health Secretary all the time, he is in perfect position to gently point out where Matt Hancock is not doing what he should do. So there's significant tension between the two. It was very striking that on the day of its publication, Matt Hancock's first tweet was to welcome the return of Test cricket, something which I personally normally would commend him for, but perhaps it struck a strange note on a day when a report which said such strong things. I mean, it really is, this is not one of those reports that pulls its punches. It really goes for it. it was strange that he would not address it in that kind of way. It was also, as you've suggested, Dave, published on Budget Day. This report, as Matt got Baroness Cumberlege to acknowledge, was one of the was in the grid to be published on this day for months and months, and they decided to do Budget Day on the same day. Now I imagine that wasn't very long conversation because of the importance of this mini budget, but they didn't move it so that it might have a bit of airtime. And that's the classic thing. If a government wants people to pay attention to something, it makes sure it has no competing news at the time. So timing is key on these issues, as is support. Back in 2009-10, I remember speaking to somebody in very senior in the nursing world and asking them about this commission. They thought it was a terrible idea, and I said, well, why are you sitting on the steering group then? And they said, because that's the best way to basically kill it, because we don't want it to say anything. We don't want to do anything particularly, so we're just going to stay in it and quietly kill it. And of course, when it wasn't really acted on by the coalition government, there wasn't a great fuss about it. Now, if you look at the Cumberlege review and you look at who they talk to, there are a number of very significant professional bodies who did not appear to have been involved in this review, weren't interviewed, didn't put in submissions, etc. Usually, as colleagues on this podcast will know very well, almost anything else that happens almost in the entire British society will produce a welter of responses from professional bodies, think tanks, etc., etc. Our comment on so-and-so report. I believe that up until this stage, the only official one we've had is from the Royal College of Surgeons. Is that right, Matt? Have you seen any other, or Dave, indeed, have you seen any other responses to Cumberlege?
Well, I've just been looking at the Twitter account of NHS providers, for example. Unless I'm very wrong, in which case apologies. I've not seen a great deal. I mean, we do get regularly lines sent from us from NHS providers about what's happening for the day, and we have not seen anything. I've not seen anything from Confed or any of the
or from the British Medical Association,
no.
Or for the Royal College of Physicians. From the Royal College of Nursing, obviously very relevant. It is very striking.
Particularly, it's specifically a kind of particular issue for the Royal College of Midwives and of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and that was, I think, Matt, that question was asked at the press launch, I believe, as well, about the involvement of those organisations, and the answer was that they hadn't. I think the answer given, perhaps you could clarify, was that they hadn't submitted anything in writing to the review initially, and they thus appears that they've just decided not to interact with it at all throughout. Is that
yeah, and I seem to remember, I believe it was Baroness Cumberlege, she said we can't force them to cooperate, which I thought was a very telling comment.
So just the third element to talk about in terms of sort of its reception, and before we go on to talk about whether we think this is a good report or not, and indeed should be paid attention to. The other one, so we've talked about timing being crucial, we've talked about support being crucial. The other one is context. So the context of Gordon Brown wanting to do a commission on nursing in the run-up to an election was because there are an awful lot of nurses 500,000 or more than 500,000 of them. There's enough nurses in almost every constituency to swing the result one way or the other, certainly in marginals. So you could sort of see why he was so keen on doing something like that, and you could see why Andrew Lansley wasn't particularly interested in doing it, for better or worse. If you look at the context, and this is the point I'd like to sort of finish on this particular bit, because I think it is really a quite significant one. As I've mentioned before on this podcast, I think Matt Hancock's mentor is George Osborne. George Osborne's approach, and he taught Hancock that the Conservative approach to the NHS could be summed up in 12 words: we love the NHS, we love the NHS, we love the NHS. And at the same time, if you combine that with the approach that this government has taken to get itself into power, which is the sort of Johnsonian never apologise, never explain. Now, they have apologised in this area, but it not in a way that we're apologising and we're going to do something about it. Just, we're very sorry this has happened. And also, because the approach this government has to the NHS is just to say nice things about it all the time, and to try and give it lots of money relative to other areas of public service and relative to governments that have come before it. That has only been accentuated during the pandemic period, where the Prime Minister has been leading the claps for the NHS, and where Dominic Cummings is saying the most important thing is that we build hospitals and recruit staff. This is a government which, for quite deep-seated cultural and sort of political strategic reasons, is really finds it really quite difficult to deal with it to deal with issues of where the NHS fails. Now, as listeners to this podcast will know, an organisation the size of the NHS, or a sector the size of the NHS, is always going to be failing somewhere. There's always going to be problems that need fixing. But in the love bombing approach that this government have towards the NHS makes tackling problems, the kind of things that have been identified in the Cumberlege report, really difficult for it. And as time goes on and we move out of the sort of pandemic emergency period, I could well imagine that might become a bigger problem than it seems at the moment.
Do you think that the way that this report has, you said timing is key in context, and do you think that the approach to burying this report and the sidelining of it, that resonates with a broader sidelining of sort of quality and safety as issues and concerns by government or by the sector as a whole? There's a lot of talk about lifting the regulatory burden, which has been taking place throughout the coronavirus, but lots of people hoping that burden will people within the NHS are wishing that burden to be lifted in the long term. And it's notable that Jeremy Hunt, in the piece he wrote for HSJ a couple of weeks ago, felt the need to defend CQC ratings and said that there will be attempts to scrap CQC ratings and to defend their position. Do you think that's part of this of the timing?
Well, this is a multifactorial thing as ever. The attitude to regulation and scrutiny of public services always, in my experience, is a pendulum swinging from one direction to the other. Under Jeremy Hunt, just as under Michael Gove, the pendulum, and indeed Dominic Cummings, the pendulum for school inspection swung to one end. So that happened when Hunt was as health secretary. So it's natural that it's going to go in the other direction, because it just happens all the time. You're either moving in one direction or the other. It is a fact that Jeremy Hunt was a much bigger supporter of the role of the Care Quality Commission than Matthew Hancock is. I was just thinking the other day that I'm trying to remember when Matthew Hancock has talked about the Care Quality Commission, and I'm sure he has talked about it, but I really couldn't, pin it, as opposed to the many speeches he's made, for example, on technology, to make the obvious comparison. And the sector, I think, does feel, as with any public services, the wish is always to give us the money and leave us alone. We're all like that. I don't blame anybody for having that kind of approach, but there is that push back against it. The CQC itself is not exactly covering itself in glory at the moment. It has a lot of problems of its own that we should probably devote another podcast to in the next few weeks. So I think there's a combination of things: the inevitably swinging of the pendulum back against the idea of inspecting everything, and the pandemic approach, where we've done our time, we've served at the front line. Now don't make it harder for us. And the fact that we've got a Secretary of State whose interests lie elsewhere. So I do think it's part of a broader picture. You can just imagine what Jeremy Hunt would have done with a report like this, and what he would have, how he would have used it to drive forward his agenda.
And on to the contents of the report. The recommendations themselves, do we think it's a good report? Do we think that they are recommendations which deserve to be embraced and implemented? Perhaps go for it, Alastair.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I was thinking about this, and I think it's a better report than the Francis report.
Well, I was just reflecting on the Hunt connection as well. It's not, with Francis and with any other report, it's not normal, and perhaps not a good thing for a government to immediately accept to endorse entirely any report's recommendations and to actually adopt them. Francis, many of the major recommendations were abandoned pretty quickly by the government, and including about the CQC. I think Francis recommended the merger of CQC with Monitor in a way, and Jeremy Hunt took the completely opposite tack, which was to empower the CQC and give it the rating system, which was, I don't think, featured in the Francis report. So the fact of adopting it at face value isn't necessarily the right thing to do.
For Francis, the mid-staff's inquiry was a very, very important thing. The Francis report itself was a poor report, of which, I mean, how many recommendations? 140, Dave? Is it 170 or something like that? And they were, and the government looked at them all and thought, well, we can't do anything with any of those, and actually had to invent some of its new recommendations of its own on the day of publication, because it couldn't work out what to do with any of the 140. No. So, this report is much more focused, and has a stronger sort of driving narrative. I do think it's a bit overheated. It made a great headline for us. The NHS has either lost sight of the interests of all those it was set up to serve, or does not know how best to do this. I don't believe that's true. I genuinely don't believe that's true, and I don't think there are absolutely places where that is true. But as a generic statement about the NHS, it is not true, and it's made as a generic statement. some of the specific recommendations inevitably a bit illogical. For example, they say we don't want any more new organisations. We don't top-down reorganisation, and then they suggest two new things: the Patient Safety Commission and a redress agency, which they try and pretend would not be new organisations. Like, so the Patient Safety Commission would be an individual, or the Patient Safety Commissioner would have a office of the Patient Safety Commissioner, which would be full of people. And
but am I right, Matt? The recommendation is this person is kind of an agent of Jeremy Hunt, of the chair of the Health and the Commons Health Select Committee.
Yeah, it seems to be very kind of governmental in that sort of way. It says it's obviously
parliamentary, independent of government.
Parliamentary, yes, of course, yeah, parliamentary. I apologise. Yeah, it does seem parliamentary, and it talks about politicians to account and be an advocate for patient safety towards the government. So it does seem that the parliamentary
give Jeremy a few more whole-time equivalent staff to find cases to champion.
Yeah, but we have a parliamentary health service ombudsman. I mean, so I do think there are some of the things that are a bit. I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea. In fact, I think it's quite a good idea. But trying to pretend it isn't another part of the machine and it won't expand the size of the machine is a bit misleading. I tell you what I really feel at a sort of fundamental level, that this report was about problems experienced in the great majority, in fact all cases, by women. Is that right, Matt?
Mostly women, yes.
Mostly women. And one of the big messages is that because that the problems that these women faced were dismissed as women's problems, that they weren't paid enough attention. So it does make me profoundly uncomfortable that a problem which is specifically about the way in which women are experiencing healthcare can so easily effectively be ignored by both government and the profession, almost regardless of whether the specific nature of its recommendations. It feels like its reception and the response is actually the most powerful way. Has proved its point about women's health issues not being taken so seriously better than anything actually it says in the report itself.
I agree, and just looking at the recommendations now, I've not seen a specific one on women. I could be wrong about that, but any of the major recommendations at least doesn't really specifically mention women or that kind of culture of stigmatization. So I think that's very worth. I mean, maybe if there was a more radical recommendation about that in there, maybe it would have made a bit of a difference in terms of how it's received in the wider world. But I just thought it'd be worth mentioning. Maybe that they could have done with a more major recommendation on that too, and the whole culture.
One thing I was wondering about, interested in your reflections, related to this thing the NHS, I think, NHS leaders are grappling with as we come out of the coronavirus peak, is the balance of feeling of how to enable the health service to feel that it can rapidly make change, to innovate and capture some of that ability, which a lot of people were, frankly, really enjoying that aspect of the crisis, that change in many cases kind of service improvements, albeit in some cases temporary improvements. In some cases they're things that want to be kept more long term, but a lot of that's been able to be achieved because of a huge change in the risk appetite, risk acceptance of changes to things and stopping doing things and in the health service, and it's something that given the likely financial outlook for the country and the NHS, is going to need to keep making those changes. And a lot of it's to do with clinicians, doctors, and other clinicians' acceptance of risk and change. And I just wonder, I wondered whether putting that alongside this issue of, is there going to be more scrutiny on quality and safety and the role of inspection and regulation? I wonder whether reports like this, whether they play into a kind of a ramping up of that kind of risk, concern about risk, or whether you can, as I think, I would say someone like Jeremy Hunt would advocate, that you can have, if you can move to an open culture, as the report advocates, then you can accept the risk in changes, as long as there's not going to be sort of blame coming out the other side of it. But I wondered, in that sort of in that kind of grand sweep of context of where the NHS is at, whether either of you had reflection on that.
A number of reflections. What I would say is that I think the Cumberlege report is probably the last of an era, of the Huntian era of scrutiny into the NHS. That said, we have got the mother of all inquiries looming on the horizon. The inquiry into the UK's response to coronavirus, that will make the Francis report look like a footnote. So we have to recognise that. I mean, there is no doubt that the NHS has enjoyed, not quite right word, but has appreciated the ability to just get on and do things during the pandemic period. As I say, everybody wants to be given the money and left alone to get on with it, and that's pretty much what the NHS has been done. It's been given all the money it wanted, though sometimes it at least been promised all the money it's wanted, and has got on with things on that basis. And there has been a slowing in regulation, both sort of official, like CQC inspections, but also in performance management meetings. Those have virtually disappeared. They're beginning to be reintroduced, as we talked about, as HSJ revealed this week, but it's still very much the sun. And I think, so there's a great desire, and people like providers, NHS providers, are advocating for that because their members all like it. They're advocating for that to go on. And at a regional level, we've seen people like David Sloman in London and Bill McCarthy and Mike Deegan in Manchester, to name but two examples, basically under the cover of the fog of war, basically reorganise how they go about things in a way which basically is a lot more streamlined. Now, two things I would say about that. One is that I think they've been able to do it broadly because the service quite liked them doing it and just thought, these things were logical. I'm glad that somebody's getting on with it. But the second thing is to say that if you look at, for example, the rapid discharge of patients from hospitals to care homes, now that was something that could absolutely have done with a significantly higher degree of scrutiny. So this sort of, just here's the money, get on and do it, NHS, isn't always necessarily a good thing, because the NHS did not, and I'm talking sort of corporately here, the NHS corporately did not think about, or did not care, I don't know, probably a mixture of both, about the strength or the vulnerability of the sector to which it was transferring a very significant patient load. The other thing is that there are plenty of campaigners out there who, for all kinds of reasons, political and others, are going to be banging in judicial reviews and launching campaigns around a whole set of decisions. So to some extent, the NHS will be dragged back into the world of scrutiny, whether it likes it or not.
Yeah, indeed. And Matt, I wonder if I could ask you about another part of the review that we pulled out was about transparency of, in particular, doctors' financial interests, which I suspect is a big and ongoing issue in the in medical devices and pharmaceutical kind of circles, because of their potential and perceived conflicts. And it's a long-running thing the NHS has been trying to achieve. Could you tell us what the review was recommending on that front, and whether there's any signs that will be embraced? Or
well, it's in terms of whether or not it's going to be embraced, we're going to have to see. But to cover the recommendation, it says that the register of the GMC should be expanded to include a list of financial and non-pecuniary interests for all doctors, as well as their clinical interests and specialisms. And people who follow the Patterson review will know that there was also a very similar recommendation there. The Patterson inquiry recommended a single database publicising consultants' practicing privileges and performance. So now we've got two reports, major reviews on the table, looking for the same thing. I know that Fin, a private healthcare information network, was looking at something very similar to that before the pandemic, as to whether this is adopted will depend, I suppose, on GMC's reception of it, and if and when the government responds to the Cumberlege in full as well.
Yeah, I think it also depends. I've just popped onto the BMA website, which indeed there is no statement from the BMA on the Cumberlege report, and I get sort of, whereas of course Jeremy Hunt famously picked a fight with the BMA, that this is a government that actually quite wants the BMA on side with it and doesn't particularly want to pick a fight on it. I can imagine the BMA being pretty reluctant about that particular proposal, though Chan Nagpal, who's the chair, and as a GP, will therefore, I believe that's right, Dave, GPs do have to publish their...
Well, they do, but it's very much buried. There's been a sort of running battle for at least, probably well longer than a decade, but at least a decade of people proposing. It kind of pops up in the GMS contract negotiation pretty much every other year to say, but you're going to have to publish this, and then it slips back and they kind of say, well, something, some slightly vague information will be published in a very buried way, in a way that you can't really compare it or compile it. And similarly, there was a review of medical consultants' interests, which suggested they should be published by their trusts, but then that including private income, which causes a lot of interest in consultants' private work, private work in private hospitals, which again was watered down in the final report, because, as you say, there's always strong opposition from the profession.
And just to clarify my point about the GMC, is they've not addressed the actual recommendation and to say we will definitely do this, as you might expect, but it has said we will reflect on the recommendations from the report and work collaboratively. So yeah,
I think there was a
similar story here.
Reflect on the recommendations. We will say nothing until everyone's forgotten that it was ever published.
I think this sense from Cyril Chandler, who was a sort of long-standing, eminent medical leader, who was the co-reviewer with Julia Cumberlege. He said he was giving in the press conference was that the GMC was saying, well, we don't mind it being done, but we don't want to do it. Basically, wasn't it? Don't want to do it nationally, and so and he obviously very much feels it should be done by the GMC and it should be there. So hopefully, all power to who's pushing it through.
Doctors won't like it. This government doesn't want to pick a fight with doctors, so it's not going to happen.
Right, and on that, I think we'll draw things to a close. And thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Alastair and Matt. And please click through to your podcast app and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Spread the word of HSJ Health Check, and visit hsj.co.uk to read more and subscribe. And speak to you again next week. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.